You are listening to the Unleashed and Aligned podcast, where we strip away the noise, unleash our truth, and align with our highest self. I'm your host, Felicia Dom, certified life coach, Reiki practitioner, and chakra guide, here to help women find deep love and interconnection within themselves. This podcast is here to increase awareness, inspire your journey, and educate you as you reclaim your energy and rise fully into who you are. Check the show notes for links to my healing circle, coaching, and more ways to work with me. Now, let's dive into today's episode.
Good.
Thank you for joining us in these. Welcome to Alicia Online Podcast. I am here with Miss Alison Hayes, who is returning to the podcast. She's a passionate advocate for the disability community with both personal and professional experience. She helps others navigate complex systems like Social Security and healthcare while empowering them to advocate for their needs. Alison is also the author of Thriving While Disabled and brings insight, compassion, and clarity to every conversation on disability awareness and support. These two books, Thriving While Disabled, Recognizing Bias, and Thriving While Disabled, Navigating Disability Finances, will be linked in the show notes. So don't forget to check those out. Welcome back to the podcast, Alison.
Thank you so much for having me again.
Yes, it is a pleasure. I'm super excited to dive into these topics, specifically because you are in the know. You are like the advocate, the person to go to. So yeah, I'm just really excited to get down to it and help us with our awareness, with our education, and hopefully sprinkle in some inspiration to those going through their own things. So I wanted to talk a little bit about your book. Like, what kind of inspired you and how did this book come about? Give me all the deets.
Okay, so the books are built from the blog I created. I started the blog in 2018 after my partner had his second life-altering injury, and I had to like manage all of his medical needs and help him get through all of the stuff that went with his healthcare, health insurance, and we had to decide whether or not it made sense for him to apply for SSI. And so helping him through all of that, he made me aware of just how much of a knowledge base I had and how useful and helpful it was. And when about a year after his injury, I was recovered enough from helping him and the trauma that helping him trigger the relapse we were going to do next. And he was very encouraging when I talked about, well, maybe I should do some kind of blog and build from there. And he was like, well, you definitely know all the stuff, disability. And he's like, so many people don't know what to do with health insurance, don't know who to call, don't know where to go. He's like, and you knew the right things. You knew what to say. You got me where I needed to go. So with that, I was like, all right, and threw myself into building Thriving While Disabled. Now includes the books and coaching services, as well as a couple of online courses. So I've got a lot of pieces, but it's all around helping people with disabilities navigate all of the stuff we have to face and adjusting their mindset so that they can make their lives better instead of just trying to not die.
I love the inspiration for the book. I think that this is so amazing and helpful for people because not only are you going through a traumatic experience, like you mentioned, but some people are just trying to get by. They're trying not to die. They're trying to survive something. They're trying to get back on their feet or recover from something. And this shouldn't be a barrier in their way. And so I think the information that you're putting out there is amazing and it's so needed. So tell us about a significant challenge you've faced and what's helped you get through it, whether it's for disability or going through the channels that you had to go through for your partners.
In a lot of ways, the biggest challenge that disabled people face isn't actually the disability, it's society's response to it. When I got my diagnosis, which is I have a few different things going on, but the one that had me decide I had to go on Social Security disability was my functional neurological disorder, which is basically a misfiring in the brain where when I'm under stress or hit certain emotional triggers, my brain kind of skips a beat and gives me a neurological symptom instead of the more standard responses. So in my case, that's mostly muscle jerks, movements, loss of control of limbs and body parts, things like that. And so I had to figure out how to manage that, but it also took 3 neurologists and 2 psychiatrists to actually get to the diagnosis,
Wow.
and 3 years. Getting diagnosed is a huge process. If you need disability benefits, getting benefits is a huge process. Having people have any understanding of what you're dealing with sometimes feels impossible. And so we're talking about compounding trauma with a lot of layers of stress and uncertainty on top. It's a lot for anybody to handle at any point in their life. So for me, at the age of 23, like a year after I graduated from college, I had to accept that at least for the next year or two, I couldn't have a career because my brain and body couldn't handle it. And so I had to apply for disability benefits, which is multiple levels of acknowledging failure of my body, all these different layers of messages of failure. And to put all of that together, I had to file long, complicated forms by an agency that didn't believe me to prove that I was incapable of doing my primary function in life, which at that age is to have a career and
Mhm.
have a job and work and earn money. And so I was at a very low point. I have a lifelong history with depression. And I had to sit there and spend hours and hours describing in excruciating detail all of these ways in which I had failed. And if I didn't do it well enough, I wouldn't have anything to live on.
Yeah, that's hard.
Exactly. And it was traumatic. So, like, becoming disabled was traumatic. And then having to apply for disability was another trauma piled on top. And part of why I ended up deciding to apply for disability was my father died of a brain injury a couple of months after my diagnosis. So I'd been diagnosed with a trauma responsive, stress responsive condition, had lost multiple jobs, and then had the biggest trauma of my life,
Yeah.
losing my father. He died the Saturday before Thanksgiving. Before New Year's, I recognized that I was just no way I could even think about trying to find a job because I was just in too bad shape physically, mentally, emotionally, all of it. And so I decided to apply for disability. And then I had to go in and do all of this paperwork explaining how my brain and body weren't working the way they were supposed to, and basically describing myself as a failure of a human being, and hope that I described that well enough and strongly enough for the federal government to agree and give me that label of certified as disabled.
My condolences to you, and that's a lot to go through, and that sounds extremely traumatic. And then on top of that, I think most people think, oh, I have this disability or I can't work. I'm just going to apply, and the doctors are going to back that up. And what you're describing is this long, rigorous process that should be something that is taken very seriously because obviously a lot of people will abuse the system. But going through the things that you have to go through and describing it, you would think that a doctor could just like sign off on it or something. I don't know if you have an explanation for that or if you know why, but I feel like in my mind, why is this so? It should be a strict process, but why is it so difficult on the actual person instead of going back onto the actual medical professional?
So, okay, there's a few layers to that, unfortunately. Sometimes disabilities span multiple body systems,
Mm,
multiple symptom sets. So, very often, one doctor doesn't have the answers. The other thing is there's also a lot of medical trauma that people with chronic illnesses face, especially because there's a lot of doctors who don't listen well, don't acknowledge things properly, don't listen to or respect their patient's shared experience, especially when it's a non apparent disability. And so there's actually a huge number of people with disabilities, especially women or other people with minority identities, who consistently get gaslighted by their doctors about whether or not they have a disability and how severe it is. Doctors are human too, and they make mistakes, especially with the system we have in place right now in the US, where everything goes through insurance companies. And the insurance companies are shortening the amount of time doctors can spend with their
yeah.
patients, pressuring the doctors to justify any prescriptions of any sort. There's also a lot of pressure on doctors to minimize things they can't prove. And so all of it, and the Social Security system knows that all doctors aren't created equal, but doesn't have a different thing to base their decisions on. And so they're looking for self reported symptoms and then the doctors to back up what the patient is saying.
Okay.
So it's about put all your information together and make sure you have doctors backing up every single thing you say and give us the story of why you can't work. And for some people, it's a single or interrelated conditions. But for a lot of people, the problem isn't one condition, it's multiple things that span multiple systems.
Okay.
And it's the combination that might make you unable to work. So it's messy in a lot of different ways. And there's also now with the opioid crisis that's been going on, there's a lot of pressure on doctors not to prescribe pain medication, except for the doctors who overprescribe it. And there's a lot of pressure, especially on people who are repeatedly getting pain medication, to not request as much, to not take as much, to really question them. People who have chronic pain are being pushed to underreport their pain or take less pain medication, which means because the doctors are disbelieving them because of the opioid crisis and are viewing them as drug seekers instead of people with real legitimate pain. People build up tolerances to a lot of
Right.
medications over time too. So there's layers of pressure that a lot of people with disabilities are facing. The other thing is we're socialized to fake being well. So even if we do have a disability that impacts us, we're trained to, if someone says, "How are you doing?" "Oh, I'm fine." Especially if it's a chronic condition that's happening continuously, because nobody wants to hear someone complain all the time. So there's a lot of social pressure on people with disabilities to fake being normal or fake being fine until we literally cannot do it anymore. And then we collapse and everybody's like, "Well, it can't be that bad. You know, you were smiling the other day, or you were doing this, you know, you went out for dinner, or I saw you at the beach or whatever." And it's like, okay, but people with disabilities deserve to have joy.
Mhm.
And okay, you saw me at the beach, but you didn't see the 3 days I spent resting after I had the day at the beach and the 2 days I spent resting in preparation to go there.
Right.
And
And like you said, it's that society almost like if you have a disability, especially, and I know you mentioned this, and I can't remember if it was just us talking or if it was on the podcast, how not every disability you can see. So
right.
just like what meets the eye, you can't say somebody has a disability or they don't. You can't really always see it.
And actually, more people have non-apparent disabilities than visible ones. I think it's about 30% of people with disabilities have apparent disabilities,
Okay.
which means like 60, 70% of disabilities are non-apparent.
And then people probably question, like, oh, do you really have a disability? Like you said, you're presenting as you're fine, you're trying to enjoy your life, which you should have the rights to. And then maybe behind closed doors, people don't see what that looks like and they make assumptions.
And so most people with disabilities, you don't see us on our bad days because on our bad days, we're at home in bed recovering. And so you only see us on our better days,
Yeah. Yeah.
our less bad days. And each person with a disability is going to have a different definition for good and bad. But a big part of disability that a lot of people don't process is disabilities are dynamic. They're changing all the time. There's going to be some aspect that's static with apparent disabilities, like, if you can't do anything below a certain level in your spine, you're not going to get up and walk around. But the degree of pain might be different. The care you need may have its own variations, level of fatigue, good night's sleep versus bad night's sleep, etc. And there's also people whose disabilities are only, you know, there's a lot of things that abled people don't want to see, and so they don't. So, like, as a person with a non apparent disability, I spend a disproportionate amount of my energy convincing people that I'm actually disabled and calming people down when they see me symptomatic, that that's in normal range for me, not an emergency that requires them saving me or freaking out or whatever. I've had multiple times people have assumed I'm having a seizure when no, that's just my FND symptoms acting up because I'm a little tired or got surprised or whatever. In my case, it's movement symptoms. So they see me make this weird jerky movement and jump to conclusions. I actually, for the first few years after my diagnosis, carried a letter from my doctor that stated that I do not have a seizure disorder and do not require medical care. So that if somebody tried to call an ambulance for me or tried to hold me down or anything like that, I could pull that letter out and say, no, really, I'm fine. Because very often when you have a disability, abled people or people who identify as abled don't listen to you.
I was just going to ask you what kind of awareness do you wish people had about people with unapparent disabilities, or what education do you wish that they would heighten in their life?
So the first thing to recognize is just how prevalent disabilities are. Over a quarter, 27% of the US population has at least one disability. That's all different kinds, all different levels of disability, but a lot of them are things we don't even think about or recognize as disabilities. For example, having vision issues is a disability. There's a percentage of us that's mostly repaired through glasses or contacts, and glasses are the only assistive technology that isn't stigmatized.
I didn't know that,
I
but
mean,
that
think
makes
about
sense.
glasses have become a potential social statement too. They make designer glasses, they make
Fashionable.
glasses can be fashionable, but canes, wheelchairs, all of that, you see someone with them and your brain goes, they're broken. And very often people then express their ableism by making additional unwarranted presumptions. Oh, I see somebody in a wheelchair. Maybe I need to speak slowly for them. Oh, I see somebody using a cane. I'm going to give them space, which can be useful, but I don't know if I want to talk to them. And so on. And so there's these like layers. And part of that is our bias of if someone's sick, you tend to give them space. And people too often equate disability with sick.
And also, I think like people unintentionally make them feel a certain way when they're trying to be quote unquote helpful and like rush over or like you said, like talk slower, things like that that they think that they're being nice and helpful, but they're actually excluding them in a social manner.
Yes, exactly. And there's actually a term for that, which is benevolent ableism. The person who's doing it has what they view as good intentions. And so, along those lines, recognize that mobility and accessibility tools need to be viewed as an extension of the person's body. So, for example, somebody who's a wheelchair user, you don't push their wheelchair unless they ask you to, because their wheelchair is their legs. If you wouldn't grab somebody's legs, don't grab their wheelchair.
I mean, that's a statement to live by. Don't
Well,
grab
yeah,
somebody's legs, don't grab somebody's wheelchair unless
right.
they ask you.
Right. If they ask you, that's fine. Cool. They're fatigued. They want someone to push them. Cool. But never assume.
Right.
You'll see people who have mobility devices, people want to move them out of the way. Well, guess what? If you move it out of their reach, they can't get up now.
Right.
There are things like that for every condition. It's about recognizing that people are different and accepting differences. Don't make presumptions. If you see somebody who has the wheelchair symbol on their license plate or has the blue disability placard, believe it. Don't tell them you don't look disabled. You can't park in a disabled parking spot. There's a lot of people who have balance issues or energy issues.
Hmm.
That's why they need it.
Right.
It's not about how somebody looks. You don't look disabled isn't a compliment. Respect the needs of people with disabilities, but don't overreach.
Right. I know exactly what
Uh,
you're talking about because I've been with people who have either chronic back pain or they have trouble walking and they'll get out and walk into the store and people will look at them either whether they're looking and giving that look like their judgment or
mhm,
they've actually said something too. And I agree with you. You don't know. I mean, like you said, somebody could have, we're talking about unknown disabilities, but even if they have some kind of neurological disorder or something like that that you can't even see and they walk fine and it's not about walking. It's just about them having something where the doctor feels that it's deemed necessary.
I've at a point where I had a placard because I would get symptomatic very quickly. And so it did take me extra energy to do things. And very often I'd have my legs drop out from under me while
Wow,
walking. I couldn't
that's
safely use
scary.
stairs. Right. Yeah. I couldn't safely use stairs for a couple of years because my subconscious stopped warning me when symptoms would come on. And so I'd be walking down the stairs and my leg wouldn't do the next step and I fell down. So, you know, there were a lot of things I couldn't do during that time. And one of them was it wasn't as safe for me to walk and it was more tiring. So I got the placard and used it for, that year or so that things were really bad. And then as soon as I was in better enough shape, I didn't need that, I stopped using it. And so it's about trusting the judgment of the person with the disability. And is it possible somebody might abuse the system in some way? Sure. But don't go out there assuming that's what's happening just because you don't see the problem.
Right. And so we're talking about the difference between this accessibility and true inclusion. So, how, in your words, can we do better at the being respectful and treating everybody with this inclusion mindset?
The first thing really is don't assume. Like when we were talking last month about the LGBT community and how bi people are generally not acknowledged or noticed,
Right.
same kind of thing with the disability community. A huge percentage of the disability community isn't recognized as being disabled. And some of them, because disability as a term is so stigmatized, don't identify themselves as being disabled. Just they've got this little difference.
Hmm.
So the first thing is really don't make assumptions. Just because you see someone using a mobility or accessibility tool doesn't mean any other part of them doesn't work properly. So, like I said, those examples of seeing somebody moving strangely or in a wheelchair, etc., doesn't mean that they need you to speak louder or more slowly or any of those other presumptions. Same thing goes with language usage. If a person, if their speech is impaired, that doesn't mean their cognitive ability is, and
Right.
so on. So it's this accept what you see and don't assume that that means any other limitations.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you mentioned that as well, because I think some people do assume when they're, talking to somebody, or if they look a certain way, that there's other parts of them that maybe can't comprehend something or they don't understand something. And you made a great point, because there's a lot of people with speech impediments or even visible disabilities that are completely able to comprehend what you're talking about, probably have a higher IQ than you. And so I think that's a great point that you've made. All those points are wonderful. And I think that's very useful.
And along those same lines, just because somebody might have a mental health diagnosis or be on the autism spectrum, that doesn't mean they're less human in any other way. And so it's this don't assume, don't presume. And instead of going around life assuming everybody you interact with is able, go the other way. Think, well, they might have a disability I just don't see. Create space where it's safe for somebody to say, I don't have the energy to do that thing, or no, I can't walk 5 blocks. I have a lot of friends who have energy related issues or pain related things that are triggered by walking too far or exerting themselves too much. And so
Yeah.
what'll happen is they look fine. And so somebody be like, hey, let's go out for lunch. It's only a 5 block walk, or it's just around the corner. And that's more than they can comfortably do. But how do you steer them? Because you want to go out to the meal with them, you want to spend the time, but you can't do what they assume you can. And that becomes more feeding into the societal failure messaging that we already have everywhere. What do you mean you can't walk 5 blocks? What do you mean you're not up for going on a hike? And too often, able people, I can't, as I don't want to. It's only 4 blocks away. I can't walk 4 blocks. Oh, so you must not really want to go out to lunch with me.
It kind of reminds me of how if you're a certain size, people just assume like you're fit or you're not fit.
Absolutely. And fat phobia and ableism are relatively intertwined because a lot of people who are heavier and have a chronic condition, it's very often presumed that if only they lose the weight, they wouldn't be disabled. When very often the weight is the result of the disability. For example, a lot of antidepressants make it much harder for a person to lose weight and can cause weight gain just because they're antidepressants. Do I want to be thin and miserable or emotionally balanced and maybe a bit heavier?
Right. I was listening to a podcast where this lady has cancer, She was promoting a book or something, and she was talking to somebody, and the lady was like, "Oh my god, you look so amazing." And she's like, "Thanks, it's called chemotherapy, you should try it." And
Yeah.
she was, like, talking about how we're, like, as a society, glorifying this ridiculously skinniness when
Mhm.
it's actually very harmful,
Mhm.
and it's not healthy. And I also think that people that are maybe have a smaller body composition, people assume they're very healthy when they could have a chronic disability, an illness, or some type of energy deficiency. Depression can do that to you, where maybe you think they're more able just because of using our eyes. And I think the more that I talk to people and do these interviews, the more I think our five senses deceive us the most, because we're basing so much things off of, like, mainly what we're seeing,
Yep.
and not really utilizing some of those internal senses like energy
Mhm.
to navigate people and, like, what the actual person is inside, who they are, and getting to know people on more of an emotional, energetic level. Instead, we're seeing
Yep.
things as, like, face value and maybe what society says in our ears. And that can be really detrimental, and it can disconnect us as a society.
Oh, absolutely. And like ableism is a very, very deeply entrenched bias.
Mhm.
All of our system of government and our system of healthcare, all of it has a very deep ableist bias. Even the fact that there are programs, disability programs usually are not actually to help people with disabilities. It's to help the subset of the disabled population that are too disabled to work, which means they've created an artificial line that all too often people with disabilities are forced to either emphasize their inability to work, which again, we take as a social failure, a measure of inadequacy for every other aspect of life, or force themselves to do more than they can sustainably handle so that they aren't labeled as too disabled to work, causing themselves to later become too disabled to work when if they'd been able to live in a happy medium their whole life, they would never have gotten that debilitated. There's a lot of pieces to this. And worshiping skinniness also leads to things like eating disorders
Mm.
and reinforces a lot of dysmorphia of various sorts and discomfort in your own body. Somebody who's naturally big boned is going to feel out of place when clothes are designed to fit models, many of whom are struggling with eating disorders or other mental health things because that's the only way they can continue as models because they have to be that super skinny ideal that has been pushed on people. And all too often, the health and wellness industry also presumes that people are abled and doesn't really have any support in place for people with disabilities to participate and help themselves get better within the constraints of their disability. So, like, I'll sometimes wince when, for whatever reason, I'm being described as part of the health and wellness industry for that reason, because there's a little too much toxicity sometimes.
Yeah.
Because the ideal is skinny, not healthy weight.
Right, and healthy weight can look different on
Different
different
people.
people.
Right.
So I think that when we really take a step back and understand everybody has their differences, and healthy looks different. Maybe society wants to categorize it, like they want to categorize what a disability looks like, what a special need looks like, what a quote unquote normal person looks like. But we really can't put that into anything, because we're all abnormal in our own ways. We're all unique in our own ways. We're all special in our own ways. And like you said, most of us have some type of disability, whether it's visible, not visible. And so I think that that is such a good point of really getting to know the person and understanding that you can't judge a book by its cover.
And along those same lines, what I've found is people with apparent disabilities tend to get the social rejection very quickly. People don't talk to them, or they're the only kid at the table at lunch, or people don't approach them. When you have a
What?
non-apparent disability, the rejection can feel a lot more personal because it doesn't happen immediately. It happens after you aren't able to go to a certain number of events, or you don't
Mhm.
have the spoons to keep communicating to the same degree, or other more subtle things. Are they rejecting me because of my disability, or do they not like me as a person? And so it can be a different kind of negative impact on self esteem, because even if you're able to work full time, what that turns into is you still have fewer usable hours in the day because it takes time and energy to manage your disability, whatever it is,
Mhm.
or you need more sleep to recover from your day. And either way, it results in less time to do leisure activities. Disabled people are statistically more likely to be financially poor. Even if we earn the same income, we spend more money on our medical care, our self care, our mobility aids, or other accessibility tools. And we have fewer hours in the day that we can spend on what we'd like to spend it. So if we're spending that time working, maybe we can't go out for dinner with our friends or can't exercise. There's always going to be a loss as long as we're expected to meet the normative standards. Humans tend not to like difference that much. So they're different from me in a very obvious, very visible way. So why would I reach out? Then there's also just the fear of making a mistake. Because, okay, if I'm going to be a sensitive person, what can or can't I say to somebody in a wheelchair or somebody who's blind or whatever? I don't want to seem ableist to them. So maybe I just won't talk to them so I won't offend them.
Yeah, I think that that's a big one too. And I think that one of the reasons why I wanted to do this too is to bring awareness to the different ways that we interact in our society and how that reflects on different individuals.
The other part is so much of our society is built with an ableist bent
Mhm.
that there's so much extra effort that does have to go into things. For example, most homes have multiple steps to get into them.
Right.
So if you're a wheelchair user, it's hard to be invited over to somebody's house and actually be able to go because, like, you only think about putting up a ramp if you have a family member or somebody who lives with you who needs a ramp. Okay, but what about your new friend who happens to use a wheelchair?
Right.
Well, they can't come over to your house unless you make a ramp. And then once they get into the house, can they get around? Same kind of thing. If somebody's blind, they do need some form of guidance, which might be a guide dog, which might be a white cane, which might be hold it onto your arm and you tell them what's going on. But all of that, that's work.
Yeah.
And so because the ableism is so severe, there's more work and you're not mentally prepared to do it. And oh my God, that's so much effort. I can just hang out with the person who's more like me and I don't have to worry about those things.
Yeah.
It's an increased mental load. And I'm not saying it's right. I'm
Yeah.
just saying these are the kinds of things that can happen. And it might not even be a conscious thought.
Right. Yeah.
It might just be the little thing in the back of your head. And you don't know why you decide not to see him, but you've got all of these little layers of, but what if? And so it's a little more effort and energy to go over and say hi. And it shouldn't be, but we're trained to have a fear of failure.
Yeah.
And
And what if you
right,
don't do something
what if you
right or
do
you
it wrong?
don't say, yep, I agree with that.
So
So I want to kind of shift gears and talk about your book, Thriving While Disabled: Navigating Disability Finances, because you talked earlier about, you know, the people with disabilities tend to be more financially poor due to all of the medical things that are involved within that. And so, does your book kind of help a person navigate so they're able to work through some of those things within their disability and their finances?
That's part of it. It's the way that navigating disability finances works is it's designed to help people recognize why it's harder and how it's harder, and then see the tools that can help them with the process. So, like, I've got a whole chapter on protecting your employment. If you're working and you become disabled, you do have the right to take time off and protect your employment. You do have the right to have accommodations made for you. And so I go into the legalities and the bias they're likely to face while trying to get the legalities to happen.
Oh, I love that.
So it's illegal to discriminate against somebody based on them having a disability, but that's not always an easy thing to prove. So let's talk about both how you're legally protected and why it's hard to prove so you can have a better chance of documenting things properly if you need to go that far.
Yeah, I think that that's something that most people aren't prepared to work on or face when they just got diagnosed with a disability. I think that's such good information to have, especially somebody that might be new to this, you know?
Exactly. And I have a chapter on applying for disability, but a big part of it is about the mindset around it. Like I said, it's emotionally very difficult work, and it's work you only want to do if that is your best option. So, the chapter before, I'm talking about society's expectations for you when you work and what you might expect of yourself, how your disability might impact that, and how you might be treated at work and what work culture is like. Your understanding of work culture might change when you become disabled. And so that chapter's like, okay, can you still work? Does it make sense to try to keep working? Should you keep your job? Should you try to find a different one? And then the next chapter is, okay, if you really can't work, protect your mental self while applying. And here's what to expect when you go through that application process. So people are more mentally and emotionally prepared and less likely to be surprised because only about 38% of initial applicants get on disability first try. And just that part of the process will usually take a year or more due to the current administration. Now it's going to take even longer. And during that time, you can't have substantial income because if you do, they're going to say, well, obviously you aren't disabled because you're able to work.
Right.
So, and the book also talks about looking at things like transportation systems and saving yourself energy and what the rules are for working well on benefits. And I just kind of take people through a lot of the challenges they're likely to face. I actually start that book with a chapter on how federal poverty levels are determined and how countries identify poverty levels so that you can understand bigger picture how they understand poverty and being poor than the kinds of support you might be able to get due to being poor, because most disabled people end up on those poverty related programs, especially if they can't work and get onto the disability supports, because the disability support programs put you in or near poverty just by themselves.
I think that this is such great work. I love that you have mindset information in this because, like you said, you're going through a lot. There's a lot
Mhm.
of things that are coming up. You have amazing information to start. What is the poverty line? Where is it? How do they determine it? And then the mindset is so powerful and it's such a weight and a stress for somebody to have to navigate these systems. I think it was so smart that you put that in there. You really want to talk them through like, is this the right decision? How do you know if you decide to make it? Here's some other information for you. So, yeah, I think that these books are going to change people's lives. I am so happy that you're making this impact in the world. Again, the two books are Thriving While Disabled, Recognizing Bias, and Thriving While Disabled, Navigating Disability Finances. We are going to put links to those in the show notes. But Allison, is there any last words of encouragement, inspirational nuggets, awareness, insights that you might want to touch on before we end?
I just I want to make sure people understand that disabilities generally are not the fault of the person with the disability. They're very often the result of accidents, genetics, things like that. And our societal messaging tends to be that of personal failure, just like poverty is often seen as the result of people making poor choices, but is very often the result of government policy. Disabilities are very often the result of luck and societal bias rather than being the problem of the individual with the disability. But in both cases, both poverty and disability, all too often, the person in that situation is made to feel guilty and responsible
Mm.
for being there. So, my big thing through both of my books, through all of it, is this is not your fault, but it is your responsibility to make sure you get the care you need.
I love it. You're not broken, but take care of
Exactly.
yourself.
Exactly. It's
Wow.
not your fault, but the only person who's going to take the best care of you is you.
Yes. Amen. Well, thank you so much for being back on my podcast. It's always a pleasure. And I can't wait till everybody listens. I think there's such good information and read your books. And I can't wait to have you back on.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right. If you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review so that we can connect with more people to develop our mind, body, and spirit.